Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into one of the most explosive moments in ancient mythology, a cosmic rebellion that would reshape the very nature of existence itself. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going back more than 4,000 years to the clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia, where scribes recorded something extraordinary. Not a myth about heroes or monsters, but a story about workers, divine workers, who had finally had enough. This is the story of the First Anunnaki Revolt, and it's far stranger than anything you might expect. Long before the pyramids rose from Egyptian sands, before the Greeks carved there, marble temples the Sumerians were writing. Their civilization flourished in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq. They invented writing, complex mathematics, and sophisticated irrigation systems. But more than that, they preserved their understanding of the cosmos, of creation, and of the beings they believed shaped reality itself, the Anunnaki. The name means those who came from heaven to earth, and in Sumerian cosmology, these were the great gods, the ones who held dominion over the elements, the seasons, and the fate of the world. But the Anunnaki weren't the only divine beings in this universe. Beneath them in the hierarchy were the Igigi, sometimes called the lesser gods, though that term hardly does justice to their role or their suffering. Picture this. The world is young, newly formed from the primordial waters. The gods have separated heaven from earth, established the foundations of creation, and now they face a monumental task. The land is wild, unformed, and unproductive. Rivers need to be controlled, canals need to be dug, and the work is backbreaking, endless, brutal. For 40 years, according to the Atrahasis epic, one of our primary sources for this event, the Igigi toiled. They dug the great rivers, they carved out the Tigris, they shaped the channels that would bring life-giving water across the land. Imagine divine beings, immortal and powerful, reduced to manual labourers. Day after day they hauled earth and stone, they wielded picks and shovels. Their hands, which should have shaped destinies, instead shaped drainage ditches. The text describes their work in vivid detail. They carried baskets of earth on their backs, they cut through mountains, they dredged river bottoms, and all of this under the direction of the great Anunnaki, particularly Enlil, the god of air, wind, and storms, who served as the overseer of this cosmic construction project. Enlil represented order, structure, and authority. He was not cruel by nature, but he was absolute in his expectations. The work had to be done, and the Igigi were the ones assigned to do it. But here's what the ancient texts capture so brilliantly, something that resonates across every culture and every age. There's a breaking point. Push anyone, even a god, hard enough and long enough, and something snaps. The Atrahasis epic, written in Akkadian but drawing on older Sumerian traditions, gives us the most complete account of what happened next. The tablet discovered in the ruins of ancient libraries tells us that the Igigi reached their limit, not in some dramatic moment, but through simple exhaustion. 40 years of labour had ground them down. The text says they cried out, they complained, they grumbled among themselves about the endless toil. And then, one night, everything changed. The Igigi made a decision. They would work no more. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was planned, deliberate, and symbolic. The text describes how they set fire to their tools. Think about that image for a moment. Divine beings gathering their picks and shovels, the implements of their bondage, and setting them ablaze. The flames lit up the night sky, a beacon of defiance that could be seen for miles. But they didn't stop there. They marched together, a unified force of lesser gods, toward the dwelling of Enlil himself. This was no small thing. Enlil was among the most powerful of the Anunnaki, second only to Anu, the sky god. To approach him in anger, to confront him with demands, was to risk everything. But the Igigi had nothing left to lose. The text tells us they surrounded Enlil's house in the middle of the night. They didn't attack, didn't try to force their way in. Instead, they made their presence known through sheer numbers and through their unified voice. They were done. No more canals, no more rivers, no more endless grinding labour. They wanted freedom, or they wanted an end. Now imagine being Enlil in this moment. You're a god of order and authority, and you wake to find your house surrounded by an angry mob of divine workers. The text describes his reaction with remarkable psychological insight. He's afraid. Yes, a great god, afraid. Not of physical harm necessarily, but of what this represents: chaos, disorder, the breakdown of the cosmic hierarchy he helped establish. Enlil sends for Anu, the sky god, his father and the nominal head of the divine pantheon. He also calls for Enki, known in some texts as Ea, the god of wisdom, fresh water, and crafts. These three, Anu, Enlil, and Enki, form a kind of divine triumvirate, and now they face their first major crisis. The workers have revolted. The Atrahasis epic gives us the dialogue, preserved across millennia on clay tablets. Enlil speaks first, and his words drip with indignation. "What have I done to deserve this?" he asks. "These Igigi have surrounded my house. They've abandoned their work. They've turned against me." There's a sense of genuine hurt in his words, as if he cannot comprehend why the lesser gods would object to the system he established. But Anu, older and perhaps wiser, sees the situation differently. "Why don't we investigate?" he suggests. "Let's hear what they have to say. Perhaps their grievance is justified." This is remarkable. In many ancient myths, divine authority is absolute and unquestionable. But here, we have a god suggesting that even divine decrees might need review, that even the complaints of lesser beings deserve a hearing. Enki remains silent for now, but his silence is telling. Enki is the trickster god, the clever one, the problem solver. He's watching, listening, calculating. The divine council convenes, and a representative of the Igigi is brought forward to present their case. The text doesn't name this representative, which is itself significant. This isn't about one troublemaker or one rabble-rouser. This is collective action, and the representative speaks for all of them. "The work is too hard," he says, and then comes the crucial line. "The distress is too much. We are dying from this labour." Can gods die? The ancient Mesopotamians had a complex understanding of divine mortality. Gods could be killed in battle, could fade away if forgotten, could suffer and weaken. So when the Igigi say they are dying, it's not metaphorical. They mean their essence, their divine nature, is being worn away by the endless crushing labour. Enlil's response is instructive. He doesn't deny the hardship. He doesn't claim the work is easy or that the Igigi are exaggerating. Instead, he focuses on authority and order. "I gave the command," he essentially says. "This work must be done. If you defy my command, you defy the cosmic order itself." It's the eternal argument of authority figures everywhere. The law is the law. The system is the system. Your suffering, while regrettable, is necessary. But then Enki speaks, and everything shifts. Enki has been thinking, and Enki has a solution. It's not the solution the Igigi asked for, not exactly freedom in the way they imagined it, but it is a way out. "Why don't we create a substitute?" he proposes. "Let us make a being to bear the yoke of the gods. Let us create primitive workers who can do this labour instead." The room falls silent. Create a new being, shape life itself to serve as replacement labourers? It's audacious, unprecedented and brilliant. Anu and Enlil consider the proposal, and this is where the story takes its most famous turn, the creation of humanity. But before we dive into that process, we need to understand what Enki is really proposing. He's not suggesting a permanent solution to an unjust system. He's suggesting a transfer of burden. The Igigi won't be free in any absolute sense, but they will be free from the specific labour that's destroying them. Someone else, something else, will do that work. The text is clear about the purpose of humanity in this cosmology. We are created as a labouring class, as beings whose fundamental purpose is to relieve the gods of their toil. This isn't the noble creation story of Genesis, where humanity is made in the divine image to have dominion over the earth. This is workers creating replacement workers, a cosmic labour contract written in clay and divine blood. Enki calls upon Nintu, also known as Ninhursag or Mami, the mother goddess, the one skilled in shaping life. Together they will perform the act of creation, but it requires more than just divine will. It requires sacrifice. The text describes how they slaughter one of the Igigi, a god named Wheeler in some versions, who is described as the ringleader of the revolt. His blood is mixed with clay, that fundamental element of Mesopotamian cosmology, and from this mixture, humanity is formed. Think about what this means. Every human being, according to this tradition, carries within them the blood of rebellion, the essence of a god who stood up against unjust authority. We are quite literally born from divine revolt. The creation process is detailed in the Atrahasis epic with remarkable specificity. Nintu takes the clay mixed with divine blood, and she pinches off 14 pieces. 7 she shapes into males, 7 into females. These are not individual humans, but prototypes, templates from which all of humanity will spring. She shapes them with her hands, speaking incantations over each one, giving them form and function. The text describes how she establishes their nature. They will grow in the womb, they will be born, they will mature, they will labour, and they will die. This last point is crucial. Unlike the gods, humans are mortal. Our lives have an ending which makes us fundamentally different from the divine beings we're created to serve. We are temporary, replaceable, a renewable resource for divine industry, but there's something else in the mix besides just clay and blood. The text mentions saliva, spittle from the gods, which some scholars interpret as breath or spirit. So humanity is earth, divine essence, and divine breath. We are matter animated by a mortal spirit, but bound to mortality by our clay nature. It's a complex theology, one that recognizes multiple aspects of human existence. Once the prototypes are created, Nintu places them in the wombs of 14 birth goddesses, 7 male prototypes and 7 female prototypes. After 10 months, humanity is born. Not created in an instant, but gestated, grown, brought into being through a process that mirrors the very human reproduction we would later use. The gods aren't just making automatons, they're establishing a new form of life with its own reproductive capacity. The immediate aftermath of humanity's creation is described with satisfaction from the divine perspective. The Igigi are released from their labour, they lay down their picks and shovels for the last time. The canals will still be dug, the irrigation channels will still be maintained, the fields will still be worked, but now humans will do it. The burden has been transferred. Enlil looks upon the creation and approves. Order has been restored without him having to back down or admit the system was unjust. Anu returns to heaven satisfied. Enki considers his work clever and good, and Nintu, the mother goddess, has fulfilled her role. But what about the Igigi themselves? How do they feel about this solution? The texts give us hints. There's a sense of relief, certainly. The immediate suffering has ended. But there's also something else, a kind of guilt, perhaps, or at least an awareness of what they've done. They've been freed from bondage by creating a new class of beings who will now bear that bondage forever. They've won their revolution not through the establishment of justice, but through the exploitation of those weaker than themselves. This is a profoundly cynical view of divine justice, and it reflects something the ancient Mesopotamians understood deeply. Power serves itself. Even among the gods, even in heaven, the strong will find ways to maintain their comfort at the expense of the weak. The revolt succeeded only because it threatened the cosmic order enough to demand a response. But the response wasn't liberation for all, it was substitution. Now we need to examine the Atrahasis epic itself as a historical document. The version we have was written during the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, but it draws on Sumerian traditions that are far older. The text was discovered in multiple copies, in multiple locations, which tells us it was important, widely circulated and repeatedly copied over centuries. The tablets were found in the ruins of ancient libraries, including the famous library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. Some tablets are complete, others fragmentary, but scholars have pieced together a reasonably coherent narrative from the various sources. The text is written in cuneiform, that distinctive wedge-shaped script pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, then baked hard to preserve it for millennia. What makes the Atrahasis epic particularly valuable is that it's not trying to glorify anyone. It's not propaganda for a particular god or a particular city. It's a cosmological account that treats the gods as complex characters with their own motivations, fears, and flaws. Enlil isn't purely evil, he's a bureaucrat trying to maintain order. The Igigi aren't purely heroic, they're workers pushed to their limit who accept a solution that benefits them at others' expense. Enki isn't purely benevolent, he's clever and pragmatic, solving problems in ways that maintain the status quo while appearing innovative. The epic continues beyond the creation of humanity, describing what happens when humans multiply too much, make too much noise and disturb Enlil's sleep, leading to various attempts to control or eliminate humanity, including the famous flood narrative. But the revolt itself, that initial crisis and its resolution, remains the pivotal moment. The theological implications of this story are staggering. In most creation myths, humanity is special, chosen, created for some noble purpose. In the Mesopotamian tradition preserved in Atrahasis, we're a workaround. We exist because divine beings needed to solve a labour problem. Our purpose is functional, not spiritual. We work so the gods don't have to. But buried in this seemingly bleak cosmology is something revolutionary. If humanity carries the blood of Wiyila, the rebel god, then rebellion is part of our nature. We are not naturally subservient. Our very existence is the product of divine discontent and divine revolution. The gods who created us were themselves rebels against an unjust system, and that essence flows in our veins. Ancient Mesopotamian religion didn't emphasize this aspect, of course. The official temple theology focused on humanity's duty to serve the gods through labor, offerings, and worship. Cities built massive ziggurats, temple complexes where priests offered food, beer, and goods to divine statues, feeding the gods as humanity's primary function. But the story was there, preserved in the texts, waiting to be read differently by different generations. Some scholars suggest that the Atrahasis epic might have been used to justify the social order in ancient Mesopotamia. Kings and priests occupied the role of divine intermediaries, and the labouring masses, the farmers and workers and slaves, were simply fulfilling humanity's cosmic purpose. If the gods created us to work, then working is sacred, and resistance to work is resistance to divine will. But let's look at how this story compares to other creation accounts from the ancient Near East. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, also mentions the creation of humanity from divine blood, but in that version, it's the blood of Kingu, the consort of Tiamat, the chaos monster. He's slaughtered after the younger gods defeat Tiamat, and humans are made from his blood specifically, so they can serve the gods, and the gods can rest. The theme is consistent across texts. Humanity is created from the death of a divine being, and that being is associated with rebellion or chaos. We are born from disorder so that we might serve order. It's a cosmic domestication myth. Just as wild animals were tamed to serve human needs, humans were created to serve divine needs, and our wild, rebellious essence comes from the untamed divine blood that makes us. The Eridu Genesis, another Sumerian text, gives a different account where humanity is created early in the cosmic timeline, before cities, before civilization, living as hunter-gatherers. The gods then teach humans agriculture, irrigation, and city building, essentially training their labor force. But even in this version, humanity's purpose is tied to relieving divine burden. What's fascinating is how these different accounts were all known in ancient Mesopotamia simultaneously. They weren't considered contradictory. Ancient peoples were comfortable with multiple creation stories existing alongside each other, each emphasizing different aspects of cosmic truth. The Atrahasis version emphasizes labor and justice. The Enuma Elish emphasizes order conquering chaos. The Eridogenesis emphasizes civilization and progress. All are true in their own way. Now let's talk about the Igigi themselves in more detail, because understanding who they were and what they represented helps us grasp the full meaning of their revolt. The term Igigi appears in various Mesopotamian texts, and while scholars aren't entirely certain of its etymology, it seems to refer to the great gods of heaven, or in some contexts specifically to the younger generation of gods. In the cosmology, there's a generational divide. The older gods, including Anu and the primordial deities, established the basic structure of the cosmos. The younger gods, the Anunnaki and Igigi, inherited this world and were expected to maintain it. But maintenance meant labor, and labor meant the Igigi. Some texts describe the Igigi as numbering 300, which in ancient numerology was a symbolic number meaning a great many rather than a specific count. They were organized, hierarchical among themselves, but collectively subordinate to the great Anunnaki. The division wasn't entirely clear in all texts, and sometimes the terms overlap or are used interchangeably, but in the context of the revolt, the Igigi are definitely the labouring gods. What did their work actually involve? The texts mention digging the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which sounds impossible until you remember these are gods we're talking about. But more realistically, the work probably represents the kind of massive irrigation and land reclamation projects that were essential to Mesopotamian civilization. The region between the rivers was marshy, prone to flooding, and required constant maintenance to be productive. Ancient Sumerians and Babylonians spent enormous resources on canal systems, on flood control, on draining marshes and making land arable. This work was backbreaking and never-ending. Every year, floods would damage canals, silt would accumulate, channels would need to be redredged. It was the kind of labour that entire communities would be mobilised to perform, and it was essential for survival. So when the myth describes the Igigi digging canals for 40 years, it's not just cosmic fancy. It's a metaphor grounded in lived experience. Everyone in ancient Mesopotamia knew what that labour felt like. The myth takes that universal experience and projects it onto the cosmic plane. Even the gods, it says, know the pain of endless labour. The number 40 is significant in Mesopotamian numerology and appears repeatedly in their myths. It represents a long period, a generation, a complete cycle. 40 years of labour means enough time for the work to become identity, for exhaustion to become despair, for endurance to reach its absolute limit. It's not just a long time, it's a complete lifetime of suffering, and Ila, the god who was sacrificed to create humanity, is described in some texts as the one who had the ghost, which scholars interpret as meaning he had consciousness or intelligence. He's the one who incited the others to rebel. He represents the dangerous power of awareness, the ability to step back from labour and question why it must be so. In a labour system, the thinking worker is the dangerous one. The sacrifice of Ila for the creation of humanity is loaded with meaning. He rebels against unjust authority, he organises his fellow workers, he leads them in collective action, and for this he is killed. But his death isn't simple execution, it's transformation. His blood becomes the essence of a new race of beings who will inherit his burden, but also his consciousness. There's something almost sacrificial about it in the later religious sense. Ila dies so that his fellow gods might live freely, and humans are born from that sacrifice. But unlike the sacrificial lamb of later traditions, Ila isn't innocent and he isn't willing. He's a rebel, killed by the very authorities he challenged, and then used as raw material for their solution. The psychological and political implications are profound. The ruling gods eliminate the rebel leader, but they can't eliminate what he represents. His essence goes into every human being. We are all Ila's children, carriers of his consciousness, his awareness, his capacity for discontent. The gods may have thought they were solving a problem, but they might have been planting the seeds of future resistance. Ancient Mesopotamian workers and slaves hearing this story might have understood it very differently than the priests who told it. Yes, it says humans were made to serve, but it also says humans carry within them the blood of rebellion, the spirit of a god who said enough to unjust authority. That's a dangerous story to tell your labouring classes. Let's examine the role of Enki in this drama more closely, because he's the pivotal figure who makes everything work. Enki appears in Sumerian texts as the god of wisdom, magic, fresh water, and the abyss. He's associated with the city of Eridu, believed to be one of the oldest cities in Mesopotamia, and his temple there was called Iabzu, the house of the cosmic deep. Enki is a complex deity. He's a creator and a trickster, a helper of humanity and a servant of divine authority. In the flood narrative that follows the revolt in the Atrahasis epic, it's Enki who secretly warns Atrahasis, the human hero, about Enlil's plan to destroy humanity with a deluge. Enki has a pattern of subverting his fellow gods' harsher plans while maintaining plausible deniability. In the revolt narrative, Enki's solution is genius from a political standpoint. He gives the Igigi exactly what they want, freedom from labour, without overturning the cosmic hierarchy that Enlil represents. He doesn't argue that the labour system is unjust. He doesn't suggest the gods should do their own work. He finds a third party to exploit, and in doing so, he preserves the peace among the gods. But Enki also shapes humanity with care. The text describes how he and Nintu don't just slap together clay and blood. They perform rituals, they speak incantations, they give humans not just physical form but capacity for thought, for speech, for reproduction. Enki creates thoroughly, and there's a sense that he's genuinely interested in what humans might become. Nintu, the mother goddess, is equally important to this story, though often overlooked. She's known by many names across Mesopotamian history: Ninhursag, Mami, Belet Ili. She's the goddess of birth, of the womb, of the creative power of the female divine. Without her, Enki's plan couldn't work. He has the wisdom and the blueprint, but she has the power to bring life into being. The text describes her as initially reluctant. "Why should I do this?" she asks. "Let the birth goddess create while I sit by and watch." There's resentment in her words, a sense that she's being asked to take on labour while the male gods observe and direct. But she agrees, and the text makes clear that this is her work as much as Enki's. She shapes the clay, she mixes in the divine blood, she places the formed beings into the wombs of the birth goddesses. And when humanity is finally born, she declares, "I have created, I have made. You told me to, and I have done it. Now you have removed your burden and placed it upon humanity. You have given them noise to bear. I have undone your yoke. I have proclaimed freedom." Those last lines are haunting. She proclaims freedom, but whose freedom? The Igigi's freedom, certainly. But what about humanity's freedom? We are born into bondage, created specifically to bear a burden we didn't choose. Nintu sees this clearly, and there's something in her words that suggests she understands the moral complexity of what she's done. The Divine Council's decision to create humanity rather than to reform their labour system tells us something important about power structures, both ancient and modern. When those at the top are confronted with revolt from below, they rarely choose to dismantle the system. Instead, they find ways to preserve their privilege while appearing to address the grievance. The Igigi wanted freedom from unjust labour. They got it, but only by consigning another group to that same labour. The system of divine comfort built on worker exploitation didn't change. Only the workers changed. This is substitution presented as solution, and it's a pattern that repeats throughout human history. Enlil never has to admit the labour demands were unjust. He never has to apologise to the Igigi or acknowledge their suffering. Instead, Enki's clever solution lets him maintain his authority while seeming reasonable. "See," the narrative implies. "We listened to your concerns. We found a solution. Now everyone's happy." Except, of course, for the beings created specifically to be unhappy in the Igigi's place. The text doesn't dwell on humanity's perspective, because humanity doesn't have agency in this story. We aren't characters. We're solutions. We're created, deployed, and expected to fulfill our function without complaint. The fact that we carry Wi'ila's rebel blood is a detail the gods seem to have overlooked or dismissed. But the story doesn't end with humanity's creation. The Atrahasis epic continues, describing what happens when humans multiply too successfully. We grow numerous, we spread across the earth, and most problematically, we make noise. The text says humanity's clamour disturbed Enlil's sleep, which led him to attempt to reduce humanity's numbers through various means: plague, drought, famine, and finally the Great Flood. This continuation of the story adds another layer to the revolt narrative. The Igigi revolted because their labour was crushing them. The gods created humanity to solve that problem, but then humanity itself became a problem, our very success and multiplication becoming a new source of divine irritation. The solution created its own crisis. There's almost a comedy to it, except it ends with attempted genocide. The gods create servants to make their lives easier. The servants do their job too well, become too numerous and too loud, and the gods decide to wipe them out and start over. It's the ultimate employer-employee relationship gone wrong. What saves humanity in the Atrahasis epic is Enki's intervention again. He secretly warns Atrahasis to build a boat and survive the flood. After the deluge, when Enlil discovers that humans survived, he's furious. But eventually he accepts Enki's argument that humanity should be allowed to continue existing, though with certain limitations placed on human fertility and lifespan to keep the population in check. The whole cycle, revolt, creation, multiplication, attempted destruction and survival, forms a complete narrative about power, labour, resistance, and the uneasy accommodation between rulers and ruled. Now let's address the historical context in which these texts were written and preserved. Mesopotamian civilization spanned thousands of years, from the emergence of Sumerian city-states around 4000 BCE through the fall of Babylon to Persian conquest in 539 BCE. During this enormous time span, the culture evolved, cities rose and fell, dynasties came and went, but certain core myths persisted. The Atrahasis epic as we have it dates to the Old Babylonian period, but it incorporates Sumerian traditions from much earlier. Sumer, the southern region of Mesopotamia, was where writing was invented around 3200 BCE, initially for accounting purposes. Those early tablets list grain, livestock and labour allocations. The very first writing was about economics and labour management. As writing evolved, it began to record literary works, religious texts and myths. By the time the Atrahasis epic was compiled, Mesopotamia had centuries of literary tradition to draw from. The scribes who wrote these texts were highly trained professionals, usually attached to temples or palaces. They copied older texts, composed new ones, and served as the memory of their civilization. The tablets themselves are remarkable artifacts. Clay is fragile when wet, but nearly indestructible once baked. Mesopotamian texts survived because they were either intentionally baked to preserve important documents or accidentally baked when libraries and archives burned during wars and invasions. Fire, the destroyer of so many civilizations, ironically preserved Mesopotamian literature. When archaeologists excavated ancient Mesopotamian sites in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found thousands of tablets. Most were mundane, contracts, receipts, administrative records. But scattered among them were the literary works, the epics, the prayers, the wisdom texts. The Atrahasis epic was pieced together from fragments found in multiple locations, each new discovery filling in gaps or confirming earlier reconstructions. Reading these texts required decades of scholarly work. Cuneiform was a dead writing system, last used in the 1st century CE, and its decipherment was a monumental achievement of 19th century scholarship. As more tablets were translated, the rich complexity of Mesopotamian thought became clear. These weren't primitive people with simple myths. They were sophisticated thinkers grappling with fundamental questions about justice, power, and human nature. The society that produced these texts was hierarchical and often brutal. Kings claimed divine authority. Temple complexes controlled vast wealth and land. Slaves and workers built ziggurats and palaces. When the texts describe divine labour hierarchies, they're reflecting and perhaps justifying earthly ones. The gods have workers and kings have workers, as above, so below, but the texts also preserve dissenting voices. The Igigis' revolt is told sympathetically. Their suffering is real, their grievance is justified. Even though the solution ultimately perpetuates exploitation, the initial cry for justice is recorded and preserved. Ancient Mesopotamian literature doesn't shy away from depicting divine injustice or moral complexity. The flood narrative that follows the creation of humanity in the Atrahasis epic deserves attention because it's the earliest known flood story in literature, predating the biblical Noah account by more than 1,000 years. The parallels are obvious and have been extensively studied by scholars. A god warns a righteous man, the man builds a boat, animals are saved, the flood destroys humanity, the boat lands on a mountain, birds are sent out to find land, but the motivations differ significantly. In the biblical version, God sends the flood because humanity is wicked and corrupt. It's a moral judgment. In the Atrahasis epic, Enlil sends the flood because humans are too noisy and numerous. It's not about sin, it's about convenience. We disturb divine rest, so we must be eliminated. It's a chillingly petty motivation for genocide. Enki's decision to save Atrahasis is also different from the biblical God's decision to save Noah. In Genesis, Noah is righteous. He's saved for moral reasons. In Atrahasis, the hero is simply wise, and he has a relationship with Enki. There's no moral judgment involved. Enki saves humanity not because we deserve it, but because he's grown attached to his creation, or perhaps because he likes having a workaround for divine labour problems. After the flood, the gods realize they've made a mistake. Without humans, who will work the fields? Who will maintain the temples? Who will provide offerings? The gods begin to starve, in a sense, because the labour and worship system has broken down. They need humanity more than humanity needs them, though humanity doesn't realise it. This post-flood negotiation is fascinating. Enlil is forced to compromise. He can't just destroy humanity whenever they annoy him because the system depends on human labor, so limitations are placed instead. Some humans will be barren. Some children will die young. There will be priestesses who don't reproduce. These measures will keep the population from growing too large while maintaining a sufficient workforce. It's demographic policy designed by frustrated gods, and it reflects real ancient concerns about population, resources, and sustainability. Mesopotamian cities dealt with cycles of growth and collapse. Too many people strained irrigation systems. Crop failures led to famine. The myth gives these problems cosmic significance, but the deeper message is about the relationship between power and dependence. The gods created humanity to serve them, but in doing so, they made themselves dependent on humanity. We have leverage, even if we don't use it. If humans stopped working, stopped offering sacrifices, stopped maintaining temples, the divine system would collapse. The workers are necessary, which means they have power, potential power. The kind that can be mobilized if consciousness and courage align. The Igigi understood this. They recognized that their labor was essential, that the system couldn't function without them, that recognition gave them the courage to revolt. And now humanity, inheriting the Igigi's role, also inherits that potential. Let's examine how this myth relates to other ancient Near Eastern creation accounts, and see what unique elements the Mesopotamian tradition offers. The biblical Genesis account is most familiar to Western audiences, where God creates the heavens and the earth, then creates humanity from dust and divine breath, placing them in Eden to tend the garden. Humans are created in God's image and given dominion over creation. The differences are stark. In Genesis, humanity is special, uniquely honored among creation. In Atrahasis, humanity is utilitarian, created to fill a specific functional need. In Genesis, human labor in the garden is apparently pleasant initially, becoming difficult only after the fall. In Atrahasis, human labor is difficult by design because we're created specifically to do the hard work gods don't want to do. The Genesis account has a full narrative where human disobedience leads to exile and hardship. The Atrahasis account has no fall because there's no innocent state to fall from. We're born into our purpose, and our purpose is labor. There's no golden age of humanese followed by punishment. There's just the reality of existence. Egyptian creation myths offer yet another contrast. In various Egyptian accounts, humans are created from the tears of Ra, or from the thoughts of Ptah, or emerge from the primordial mound. But they're generally created as part of a cosmic order, meant to live in Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and cosmic order. Their purpose is to maintain Ma'at through righteous living and proper worship. The Mesopotamian view is darker, more cynical, more honest perhaps about the nature of labor and power. It doesn't pretend that the social order exists for everyone's benefit. It openly states that some beings are created to serve others, that hierarchy is cosmic and fundamental, that labor is burden transferred from strong to weak. But again, that rebel blood, that consciousness inherited from Wheeler. The Mesopotamian myth contains within it the seeds of its own critique. If we're made from the blood of a rebel god, if consciousness and discontent are part of our nature, then perhaps our purpose can be questioned, resisted, reimagined. Ancient Mesopotamian workers hearing the story in temple courtyards or in the fields might have taken from it both resignation and hope. Resignation that their labor is cosmically ordained, but hope that the gods themselves know what it means to suffer unjustly, to organize, to resist. The Igigi won their freedom. Perhaps humans could too, somehow. Of course, temple priests would have emphasized the duty to serve, the proper order of things, the necessity of offering to the gods. But stories have lives beyond their tellers' intentions. They mean what listeners make them mean, and there's no controlling that. The cosmology underlying the Atrahasis epic reflects Mesopotamian understanding of the universe as fundamentally organized around labor and production. The gods themselves are specialized workers. Anu governs the sky, Enlil governs the air and earth, Enki governs the waters and wisdom. Each has a domain, a responsibility, a job. In this view, the universe is like a vast estate or a giant workshop, and everyone, divine or mortal, has a role to play. The difference is that gods can delegate their labor to others, while humans cannot. Humans are the bottom of the hierarchy, which means there's no one below us to exploit. We do the actual work. Mesopotamian temples reflected this cosmic organization. They were run like businesses, with extensive lands, workshops, granaries and herds. Priests managed these assets, workers laboured in the fields and workshops, and the products were offered to the gods through elaborate rituals. The god statue would be fed, clothed and honoured daily, as if they were a divine landlord or employer. This system made sense in a world where labour was everything. Agricultural societies are built on constant work. Fields must be ploughed, irrigated, weeded and harvested. Animals must be tended, buildings must be maintained, there's always work to be done, and survival depends on it being done efficiently. The Igigi's revolt is therefore a revolt against the fundamental nature of existence as Mesopotamians understood it. Work is cosmic law. To refuse work is to refuse reality itself. But the text treats their revolt sympathetically because it also recognizes that endless labour without rest or reward is a kind of death, even for immortal beings. The solution, creating humanity, doesn't resolve the philosophical problem. It just redistributes the burden. The work still must be done. Someone must still do it. All that changes is who carries the weight. Modern readers might see in this ancient myth a critique of capitalism, of wage labour, of any system where some people's comfort depends on other people's exploitation. The gods are like owners or managers who benefit from work they don't do. The Igigi are like workers who do essential labour for insufficient reward, and humans are like the global working poor created specifically to serve a system that doesn't serve them. The myth doesn't present this as wrong exactly. It presents it as necessary as cosmic order. But it also shows that even cosmic order can be questioned, that even gods can revolt when pushed too far, and that every solution to injustice might simply be a new form of injustice. The ancient Mesopotamians lived in this tension, honouring gods who they believed treated them as disposable labour, while also preserving stories that questioned divine justice. The character of Enlil deserves deeper analysis because he's often cast as the antagonist in these myths, but he's more complex than that. Enlil is the god of air, storms, and the space between heaven and earth. He's associated with authority, with kingship, with the power to execute decisions. He's not evil, he's order, structure, hierarchy, and the enforcement of rules. When the Igigi revolt, Enlil feels personally attacked because the revolt is against the system he embodies and enforces. He gave the command for the canals to be dug. His authority was challenged. From his perspective, the Igigi are being insubordinate, ungrateful, chaotic. The work needs to be done. He assigned them to do it, and their refusal is unacceptable. But the text also shows his fear. When surrounded by the angry Igigi, Enlil is afraid. He doesn't immediately call down storms or smite them with lightning. He calls for help, for his father Anu and his brother Enki. He needs consensus, support, a solution. Even supreme authority recognizes it can be overwhelmed by collective action. Later, when humanity multiplies and makes noise, Enlil's solution is increasingly violent. First, he sends plague. When that doesn't work permanently, he sends drought, then famine, then finally the flood, the ultimate reset button. Each escalation shows him becoming more desperate, more willing to use extreme measures to maintain control and quiet. There's something almost sympathetic about Enlil in the flood narrative. He just wants to sleep. He just wants peace and quiet. But he's responsible for maintaining cosmic order, and that responsibility weighs on him. He's trapped by his role as much as the Igigi were trapped by theirs, though obviously with vastly more power and comfort. When Enki saves Atrahasis and humanity survives the flood, Enlil's rage is intense but short-lived. Eventually he accepts the situation because the alternative is continuing chaos. He compromises, agreeing to let humanity exist but with limitations. It's a rare moment of a god learning, adapting, recognizing that total control isn't possible or sustainable. Enlil represents the authority that every civilization needs but also fears. Order is necessary for society to function, but order imposed too rigidly, maintained too violently, becomes oppression. The Mesopotamians honoured Enlil because they valued order, but they also told stories about his harshness, his temper, his willingness to destroy what he couldn't control. In some texts, Enlil is described as the one who grants kingship to human rulers, who legitimizes their authority. Kings ruled by Enlil's command, which meant questioning the king was questioning divine order. But it also meant that kings had to maintain ma'at, had to rule justly, or they risked losing divine favour. Even supreme authority had responsibilities. Enki, by contrast, represents wisdom, cleverness, and a kind of subversive benevolence. He solves problems through ingenuity rather than force. When the Igigi revolt, he doesn't argue with them or try to suppress them. He finds a way to give them what they want while preserving the system. When Enlil wants to destroy humanity, Enki doesn't openly oppose him, but he quietly undermines the plan by warning Atrahasis. Enki is the god of fresh water, which in Mesopotamia meant life itself. The region depended on irrigation from the rivers, and Enki controlled those waters. He's associated with the Abzu, the underground ocean of fresh water that was believed to underlie the earth, source of wells and springs. He's literally the god of hidden depths, of resources that sustain life below the surface. His temple in Eridu, the Abzu, was believed to sit directly above the cosmic waters. Priests would perform rituals to ensure Enki's continued blessing, that the waters would continue to flow, that the land would remain fertile. Enki was essential to survival, which gave him leverage in divine politics. His relationship with humanity is consistently protective across multiple myths. He teaches humans crafts and skills. He warns them of dangers. He intercedes when other gods want to harm them. Some scholars suggest Enki represents a different, older tradition than Enlil, possibly predating the hierarchical sky god theology. He might have been a local deity of Eridu who was incorporated into the larger pantheon and maintained his distinct character. In the revolt narrative, Enki's solution benefits everyone, apparently. The Igigi get freedom from labour. Enlil maintains his authority. Humanity comes into existence. But Enki might also have other motivations. Creating humanity gives him influence and power. Humans will worship him, build temples to him, make offerings to him. He's expanded his constituency. There's also genuine creativity in what he does. Enki enjoys making things, solving puzzles, pushing boundaries. Creating a new form of life from clay and divine blood is an intellectual and magical achievement. He's proud of it. When the gods marvel at humanity, it's partly Enki's craftsmanship they're admiring. But he also seems to genuinely care about his creation in a way the other gods don't. When Enlil wants to destroy humanity, Enki objects, not just politically but seemingly emotionally. He's invested in human survival, in our continued existence. Whether this is parental affection, craftsman's pride, or calculated, self-interest is unclear, but the effect is that humanity has a divine patron, someone in the cosmic power structure who doesn't want us to be annihilated. This makes Enki popular in later esoteric and occult traditions. He's seen as humanity's friend among the gods, the one who gives us knowledge and protects us from more hostile divine powers. In some modern reinterpretations, he becomes a Prometheus figure, stealing fire or knowledge from the gods to give to humans. The relationship between Enki and Enlil is central to many Mesopotamian myths. They're brothers, both sons of Anu, but they represent opposing principles. Enlil is law, order, authority, the sky god's power made manifest on earth. Enki is wisdom, water, adaptability, the problem solver who works beneath the surface. They need each other. Enlil's order without Enki's wisdom becomes tyranny. Enki's cleverness without Enlil's structure becomes chaos. Together they maintain cosmic balance, though often through conflict and compromise. The Igigi revolt is resolved through their interaction. Enlil provides the problem and the authority. Enki provides the solution and the creativity. This divine dialectic might reflect political realities in ancient Mesopotamian cities, where king and temple, military power and priestly wisdom had to work together to govern effectively. Kings consulted priests and diviners. Priests depended on royal protection and patronage. Neither could rule alone. The gods' relationships modelled idealized human power sharing, but it also reflects a deeper truth about power. Authority alone can't solve all problems. Sometimes you need wisdom, creativity, the ability to think outside established structures. The Igigi revolt is a crisis that Enlil's authority can't resolve through force. He needs Enki's lateral thinking. Nintu, the mother goddess, is the third crucial divine figure in the creation of humanity, yet she's often overlooked in favour of the male gods. This reflects both ancient and modern biases, but the text itself gives her significant agency and voice. She's the one who actually forms humans. Enki may design, but Nintu makes. Her initial reluctance is important. She questions why she should take on this labour. It's a feminist moment in an ancient text, a female deity pushing back against male gods who want to delegate work to her. But she does agree, and once committed, she performs her role with skill and power. The text describes her shaping each of the 14 prototypes with care, speaking incantations, performing rituals. This isn't casual creation. It's sacred work, requiring knowledge, power, and precision. She's not just following Enki's instructions, she's bringing her own expertise to the task. When the work is done, her proclamation is significant. I have created, my hands have done this. She claims ownership of the achievement, and her statement about proclaiming freedom, while ambiguous, asserts her authority in the matter. She's not passive or subordinate, she's a co-creator, and she knows it. Nintu appears in many other Mesopotamian texts under various names, always associated with birth, fertility, and the creative power of the feminine divine. She's essential to the cosmic order because without birth, nothing continues. Even gods need her power to bring new divine beings into existence. In some versions of the creation story, Nintu creates humans in her own workshop or birth house, a sacred space where divine creation happens. This space is described almost like a temple workshop, with tools, materials, and sacred protocols. Creation is work, skilled work, requiring the right conditions and the right knowledge. The mixing of clay and divine blood is described with ritual specificity. The clay must be prepared, the blood must be fresh, the mixture must be kneaded in a particular way. It's almost like a recipe, which makes sense given that Mesopotamian texts often took the form of instruction manuals for rituals, medicine, or craft. The placement of the formed beings into birth goddess wombs for gestation is also significant. Humans aren't created instantly. We grow, develop, are born through a natural process. This suggests the Mesopotamians saw human creation as establishing a pattern, a biological process that would then continue on its own. Nintu creates the first humans, but then humans create all subsequent humans through normal reproduction. This is different from myths where each human or each generation is individually created by divine action. In the Mesopotamian view, we're given the capacity for self-perpetuation. We become, in a limited sense, independent of ongoing divine creation. We can make more of ourselves. The 14 birth goddesses who gestate the prototypes are otherwise unnamed in the text, which is both typical and unfortunate. Goddesses in Mesopotamian religion often appear as collectives or types rather than individuals. The birth goddesses represent the general principle of divine feminine creative power, supporting Nintu's specific act of creation. After 10 months, the prototypes are born. The text describes this as a successful birth, which implies it could have failed. There's risk in creation, even divine creation. But it works. Humanity emerges into the world, and immediately we begin fulfilling our purpose. We work. There's no childhood described, no period of learning or development. The text moves directly from birth to labour, suggesting that humans are created fully formed and ready to work. We know our purpose instinctively, or perhaps we're taught immediately, but either way, there's no question of what we're for. This is different from myths where humans must be taught civilization by the gods, where we start as primitives and gradually learn agriculture, writing, law. In Atrahasis, we're purpose-built for a specific function, and we step into that function immediately. It's a bleak vision in some ways, but also practical. The gods didn't create us for our own sake, they created us to solve their problem, so we're designed with the solution in mind. The theological implications of being created from divine blood mixed with clay are profound and were debated by ancient scholars and priests. What does it mean to have a divine essence within mortal form? Are humans partially divine? Do we have souls that survive death? Mesopotamian beliefs about the afterlife were generally grim. The dead descended to the underworld, a dark, dusty place where they existed as shadows or ghosts, eating dirt and clay. There was no heaven, no reward for righteousness, no punishment for sin. Everyone went to the same dreary place regardless of how they lived. But if humans carry divine blood, does that change anything? Some texts suggest that exceptional individuals, kings or heroes, might achieve a different fate, but for most people mortality is absolute. The divine essence within us doesn't grant immortality, it just explains our consciousness, our capacity for thought and creativity. The clay represents mortality, decay, return to earth. The divine blood represents consciousness, spirit, the inner life. Together they make us human, caught between earth and heaven, mortal but aware, temporary but thinking. It's a dualistic anthropology that sees humans as fundamentally divided between our material and spiritual natures. This influenced later religious and philosophical thinking throughout the ancient Near East. The idea that humans are mixtures of earthly and divine elements appears in various forms in later traditions. But the Mesopotamian version is unique in being so explicit about the purpose of that mixture. We're not trying to transcend our earthly nature to become more divine. We're created specifically to use our divine consciousness to serve divine ends through earthly labour. Let's examine how the revolt narrative functions as political and social commentary. Ancient Mesopotamian society was highly stratified. At the top were kings, who claimed divine right to rule. Below them were priests, nobles, and officials. Then came craftsmen, merchants, and free farmers. At the bottom were labourers and slaves who did the heavy work that sustained the entire system. The text describes a divine hierarchy that mirrors this social structure. The Anunnaki are like aristocrats, the Igigi like working-class citizens, and humans like slaves. Each group has its place, its function, its level of power and privilege. When the Igigi revolt, they're modelling labour organisation and collective action. They don't act as individuals, they organise, they coordinate, they present unified demands. This is sophisticated political action, the kind that requires consciousness, planning, and courage. The text shows it working, at least partially. The Igigi's suffering is acknowledged and a solution is found, but the solution doesn't dismantle the hierarchy, it just shifts the burden downward. This is a pattern familiar from all of human history. When one oppressed group gains freedom or rights, often it's at the expense of another group that has even less power. Labour movements in one country might succeed by exploiting workers elsewhere. Freed slaves might oppress those still enslaved. The system continues, only the positions change. The text doesn't explicitly critique this, but it doesn't celebrate it either. It presents the creation of humanity as a solution to a crisis, but there's no sense that this is morally ideal. It's pragmatic, effective, and unsettling. The gods are satisfied, but should they be? Ancient audiences might have read this story and thought about their own positions in the social hierarchy. Am I an Igigi, working too hard for too little recognition? Am I a human, created specifically to serve others? Or am I, through some combination of luck and skill, closer to the Anunnaki, benefiting from the system rather than being crushed by it? The text doesn't provide easy answers. It shows how power works, how labour is organised, how suffering is distributed. It shows that even divine society has labour problems, that even gods can be exploited, that even cosmic order depends on someone, somewhere, doing the actual work. Mesopotamian kings would have commissioned and sponsored the copying of these texts, which is interesting. Why preserve a story about workers revolting against their masters? Perhaps because it also shows the revolt being resolved without overthrowing the masters. The Igigi gain relief, but Enlil remains in power. The hierarchy persists. Or perhaps the story serves as a warning. Ignore worker grievances at your peril. Push people too hard and they'll organise and rebel. Better to find solutions, even if those solutions simply redirect the exploitation, than to face complete breakdown of order. It's not a call for justice, it's a manual for managing discontent. But stories escape their intended purposes. The worker hearing about the Igigi's revolt might focus on the fact that the revolt happened, that it forced the gods to respond, that collective action achieved something. The fact that humans then got exploited might seem like a separate issue, or a warning about building solidarity with all workers, not just those who share your position. Revolutionary movements throughout history have found inspiration in ancient texts, reading against the grain, finding liberatory messages in stories that surface level seem to support the status quo. The Atrahasis epic is complex enough to support multiple readings. At minimum, it acknowledges that labour is burden, that burden can become unbearable, and that those who bear the burden have the right to object. Those are dangerous ideas to plant in any culture, especially one built on massive labour exploitation like ancient Mesopotamia. The Number symbolism in the text also deserves attention. 40 years of labour, 14 prototypes, 7 males and 7 females, 300 igigi. These aren't random numbers. In Mesopotamian numerology, numbers had sacred and symbolic significance. 40 represented a complete generation or cycle, a full period of time. 40 years was long enough for the entire nature of existence to change, for a whole generation to be born and die knowing only toil. It's the number of completion and transformation. 14 is twice 7, and 7 was a sacred number associated with divine completeness. 7 gods, 7 heavens, 7 sacred cities, 7 appeared constantly in Mesopotamian religion. 14 prototypes, 7 male and 7 female, represents balanced, complete creation. Nothing is missing. The template is whole. 300 was used to represent a very large number, a multitude beyond easy counting. The 300 igigi aren't a specific count, but a way of saying many, very many, more than you can easily track. It conveys the scale of the workforce and therefore the scale of the revolt. These numbers weren't chosen for realism but for symbolic resonance. Ancient audiences hearing the story would recognize the numbers as meaningful, as signals that this is a complete, sacred narrative about cosmic events. The act of burning the tools is also symbolically rich. Tools represent labor, specialization, civilization itself. To burn them is to reject not just work but the entire system that work supports. It's saying we'd rather have nothing than continue this. Fire as a cleansing, transformative, destroying force appears throughout Mesopotamian mythology. It's purifying but also dangerous. The Igigi use fire to destroy what binds them, but fire also destroyed the Temple of Artemis in Greek tradition, destroyed divine statues, destroyed cities. It's a dangerous element to invoke. The fact that the tools are specifically mentioned as being burned, not just discarded or broken, emphasizes the finality and the drama of the gesture. This is theatre, performance, a symbolic act meant to communicate resolve and desperation. The gods will see those flames and understand immediately what they mean. The march to Enlil's house, surrounding it at night, creates a siege without violence. The Igigi aren't attacking, they're making themselves impossible to ignore. They're forcing confrontation, demanding response. It's civil disobedience on a cosmic scale. The text's preservation across centuries, through multiple copies in multiple cities, tells us it was important to Mesopotamian culture. But why? What function did this story serve beyond entertainment or religious instruction? One possibility is that it explained suffering. If you're a Mesopotamian farmer breaking your back in the fields, this story tells you that labor is cosmic, ordained from the beginning of creation, part of the fundamental structure of reality. You're not suffering because of bad luck or human cruelty, but because the universe requires labor, and someone must do it. That's both comforting and horrifying. Comforting because your suffering has meaning, cosmic significance. Horrifying because there's no escape, no hope that the system might change. This is how things are and will always be. But the story also validates suffering, acknowledges it as real and difficult. The Igigi aren't weak or lazy for complaining about 40 years of canal digging. Their suffering is legitimate. Even gods can be pushed too far. That acknowledgement might have meant something to ancient workers. Another function might be to explain social hierarchy. Why do some people rule while others labor? Because that's how the universe is structured. The gods organized things this way. Kings and priests occupy the position of the Anunnaki, making decisions and receiving the benefits of others' work. Laborers occupy the position of humans created specifically to work. But the story doesn't entirely naturalize hierarchy because it shows hierarchy being contested. The Igigi revolt, and while they don't overthrow the system, they do force change. This suggests that even cosmic order can be negotiated, that grievances can be addressed, that the powerful might respond to pressure from below. Perhaps the story served different purposes for different audiences. For the powerful, it justified their position while also warning them not to push too hard. For the powerless, it acknowledged their suffering while also suggesting that conditions could improve through collective action, even if fundamental liberation wasn't possible. The text's ambiguity, its willingness to show divine injustice alongside divine authority, makes it richer and more complex than simple propaganda. It's wrestling with real problems, labor and justice and power, and it doesn't offer easy answers. Mesopotamian literature generally is sophisticated in this way, willing to depict gods as flawed, humans as capable, reality as morally complex. It's not naive or primitive, it's the product of a civilization that thought deeply about its own structures and contradictions. Modern scholarly interpretations of the Atrahasis epic vary widely. Some scholars focus on it as a creation myth, comparing it to Genesis and other ancient Near Eastern accounts. Others emphasize its social commentary, seeing it as reflecting labor conflicts in ancient Mesopotamian society. Still others read it through psychological or philosophical lenses, exploring what it says about human nature and consciousness. Feminist scholars have pointed out the significant but often overlooked role of Nintu and the birth goddesses. The text shows female divine power as essential to creation, not supplementary. Without Nintu, Enki's plan fails. This challenges readings that see ancient Mesopotamian religion as purely patriarchal. Post-colonial scholars have examined how the text was transmitted and interpreted, particularly how Western scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries approached it with their own biases and assumptions. Early translations sometimes downplayed or misunderstood elements that didn't fit Western religious frameworks. Labor historians and Marxist scholars have found the text fascinating for its explicit treatment of worker exploitation and revolt. It's one of the earliest written accounts of labor organizing, even if the workers in question are gods. The patterns it describes, grievance, collective action, negotiation, partial victory, appear throughout labor history. Religious studies scholars debate whether the text should be read literally as representing Mesopotamian beliefs or symbolically as expressing deeper truth through mythic language. Did ancient Mesopotamians actually believe the Agigi revolted and humans were created from a rebel god's blood? Or was this understood as metaphor, as a way of talking about the nature of labor, consciousness, and mortality? The answer is probably both. Ancient peoples were perfectly capable of holding literal and metaphorical meaning simultaneously, of understanding a story as both historical account and symbolic truth. The categories we use, myth versus history, literal versus metaphorical, might not map neatly onto how ancient audiences thought. What's clear is that the story resonated across centuries, was copied and recopied, was known throughout the ancient Near East, and influenced later traditions. Its themes, divine labor, worker revolt, the creation of humanity from divine sacrifice, these echoed through subsequent literature and theology. The connection between Atrahasis and the biblical flood narrative has been particularly studied. When George Smith first translated the flood account from cuneiform tablets in 1872, it caused a sensation. Here was a flood story older than Genesis, with clear parallels but also significant differences. It challenged assumptions about biblical uniqueness and prompted new questions about how religious traditions influenced each other. The discovery and translation of the Atrahasis epic and other Mesopotamian texts revolutionized our understanding of the ancient world. Before cuneiform was deciphered, scholars had only biblical accounts and Greek historians to rely on for knowledge of ancient Mesopotamia. The texts were a revelation, showing sophisticated literature, complex theology, and nuanced social thinking. Reading the Agigi's revolt in their own words, in texts written thousands of years ago by Mesopotamian scribes, gives us direct access to how they thought about labor, justice, and divine power. We're not relying on second-hand accounts or later interpretations. We have their own literature, preserved in their own language. This is the gift of archaeology and linguistics, the patient work of excavation, translation, and interpretation that brings ancient voices back to life. The Atrahasis epic isn't just ancient mythology. It's a window into how humans 4,000 years ago grappled with the same questions we still face. Why must we work? Is suffering necessary? Can we change the systems that oppress us? What does it mean to be human? Their answers, formed in a very different world, still speak to us. The Agigi's revolt still resonates because labor exploitation still exists. The creation of humanity from a rebel god's blood still fascinates because we still wonder about consciousness, purpose, and our place in the cosmos. Let's address some common misconceptions and modern appropriations of this ancient story. In recent decades, particularly in alternative history and ancient astronaut circles, the Anunnaki have been reinterpreted as extraterrestrial beings who came to Earth, created humans through genetic engineering, and ruled as gods. This interpretation, popularized by writers like Zecharia Sitchin, takes elements from Mesopotamian texts but fundamentally misreads them. Sitchin claimed the Anunnaki came from a planet called Nibiru, that they created humans to mine gold, and that much of human civilization was given to us by these alien visitors. Scholars of ancient Mesopotamia have thoroughly debunked these claims. Sitchin's translations of Sumerian and Akkadian were often wrong, his interpretations ignored context and literary convention, and his theories required ignoring vast amounts of evidence about how ancient Mesopotamian religion actually worked. The Anunnaki in the actual texts are gods, divine beings within a specific theological framework. They're not described as coming from other planets. They're cosmic forces, personifications of natural phenomena and social structures. Reading them as aliens misses what the texts are actually doing, which is exploring the nature of divinity, power, and human existence within their own cultural framework. That said, the modern fascination with ancient astronaut theories reveals something interesting about contemporary culture. We're uncomfortable with the idea that ancient peoples could have been genuinely religious, that they actually believed in gods, that their myths meant something beyond hidden historical accounts of alien visitors. There's a kind of condescension in assuming that sophisticated ancient civilizations must have been describing something scientific or technological when they talked about gods. It denies them the capacity for abstract thought, for theological sophistication, for using symbolic language to explore deep truths. The Mesopotamians were perfectly capable of distinguishing between literal and symbolic meaning. Their texts show them debating, interpreting, and thinking critically about their own traditions. They didn't need to be describing aliens. They were describing their understanding of the cosmos, of power, of labor, of what it means to be human in a universe, shaped by forces beyond our control. The Atrahasis epic is more profound as theology and social commentary than it could ever be as a garbled account of ancient genetic engineering. The questions it raises about work, justice, rebellion, creation are eternal human questions, not questions about extraterrestrial gold mining operations. Another modern appropriation comes from certain spiritual and esoteric traditions that see the Anunnaki as representing archetypal forces or as historical references to advanced pre-flood civilizations. While these interpretations are more nuanced than ancient astronaut theories, they still often miss the specific cultural context of the Mesopotamian texts. The value of studying ancient mythology isn't in proving it historically or literally true. It's in understanding what the myths meant to the people who created and transmitted them, and what they might still teach us about human nature, society, and meaning-making. The Igigi's Revolt teaches us about labor consciousness, about collective action, about how power responds to resistance. The creation of humanity from divine blood teaches us about embodiment, about the relationship between matter and spirit, about how different cultures have understood human nature and purpose. These lessons don't require the stories to be literally true or to be encoding secret historical facts. They work as stories, as explorations of ideas through narrative, character, and symbol. That's what mythology does, and it's enough. Let's return to the texts themselves and examine some specific passages that scholars have debated. One crucial line describes the Igigi as having the ghost, or in some translations, consciousness, or intelligence. This is attributed specifically to Wi'ila, the god whose blood is used to create humanity. The Akkadian term is Temu, which can mean thought, intelligence, consciousness, or understanding. The fact that this quality is emphasized tells us the Mesopotamians saw consciousness as a distinctive feature, something that marks certain beings as special. Wi'ila has Temu, and it's precisely because he has this quality that he can organize the revolt. When his blood is mixed with clay to create humans, that consciousness passes to us. We inherit not just divine essence, but specifically the consciousness that enabled divine rebellion. This is extraordinary theologically. It means human consciousness isn't just a byproduct of creation, but an inherited trait, passed down from a rebel god. Some scholars have connected this to the biblical concept of being made in God's image. Both suggest humans have a quality that makes us like the divine, that sets us apart from mere matter. But the Mesopotamian version is more specific. We're like a particular god, one who defied authority. Our consciousness is fundamentally rebellious. Another debated passage describes the actual moment of creation when Nintu mixes the clay and blood. The text says she pinched off 14 pieces, which some scholars translate as nipped off or separated. This suggests a physical, almost sculptural process, like working with pottery. Mesopotamian artisans were skilled at working clay, and the image of a goddess as divine potter makes sense in that context. But there might also be a connection to childbirth, to the act of separation that happens when a child is born. Nintu is the birth goddess, and creation is described using birth imagery. The incantations she speaks during creation are partially preserved in some versions of the text. They're in Sumerian, which by the time the Atrahasis epic was written was already an ancient sacred language, like Latin in medieval Europe. Using Sumerian for the creation incantations gives them additional weight and mystery. Unfortunately, the incantations are fragmentary, and their meaning is disputed. They seem to involve setting the nature and function of the beings, being created, establishing their characteristics and destinies. But without complete versions, we can't be certain of their full content. The placement of the proto-humans in birth goddess wombs for gestation is also significant theologically. It suggests that even divine creation follows natural processes, that there are rules and patterns even for gods. You can't just speak humans into existence. They must be formed, gestated, born. This is different from the biblical let there be light model where divine speech creates instantly. The Mesopotamian model is craftwork, slow and careful, following procedures, requiring skill and time. It makes creation feel more laborious, ironically appropriate for beings who will spend their lives labouring. The 10-month gestation period matches human pregnancy, which might seem obvious but isn't necessarily. The gods could have created humans with any gestation period, or none at all. The fact that it matches human reproduction suggests the pattern was established from the beginning, that the prototype set the template for all future humans. After humanity is born and begins working, the text describes the gods' satisfaction. They marvel at the creation, at how well it works, at how humans fulfill their purpose. There's no mention of teaching humans how to work. We apparently know instinctively what to do, which supports the idea that we're purpose-built. But the text also mentions humans learning language, which is interesting. We're not created already speaking. Language must be taught or developed. This suggests a period of development between birth and full functionality that the text doesn't detail, but acknowledges exists. Some scholars see this as evidence of different textual traditions being combined. One tradition might have humans created fully formed and functional. Another might have them born helpless and needing development. The final text preserves elements of both without fully reconciling them. The cosmic consequences of humanity's creation are also worth exploring. With the Igigi freed from labour and humans taking their place, the divine economy changes fundamentally. Gods can now focus on their proper roles, governing, creating, maintaining cosmic order, while humans handle the physical labour of maintaining the world. This division of labour is presented as beneficial for everyone, or at least for the gods. The Igigi celebrate their freedom. The Anunnaki enjoy the benefits of human labour. Humans exist and have purpose, which is presented as a kind of good, though not one we chose. But the text hints at problems ahead. Humanity multiplies rapidly, filling the earth. We're successful, perhaps too successful. The noise we make, the space we take up, the resources we consume, all become issues. The solution to one crisis creates the next. This is a pattern throughout the Atrahasis epic and throughout history. Fix one problem and generate new ones. Free the Igigi by creating humans, then deal with humanity's multiplication. Reduce humanity through plague, but that's insufficient. Send famine, still insufficient. Finally, the flood, the attempted total solution. The escalation of Enlil's responses to humanity reflects a kind of desperation. He can't just command humans to be quiet or fewer in number. We don't obey divine commands in the way the Igigi did. We're not directly part of the divine hierarchy. We're separate, independent in ways that make us harder to control. This is ironic given that we were created specifically to be controlled, to serve. But by making us mortal, reproductive, and conscious, the gods gave us qualities that lead to independence. We make our own copies of ourselves without needing divine intervention. We think and plan and act according to our own understanding. We're only partially under divine control. Enlil's increasing violence toward humanity might reflect his frustration at having created beings who won't stay in the box he designed for them. The worker revolts not through organized action like the Igigi, but through sheer multiplication and vitality. We're too alive, too successful at being what we were designed to be. Enki's consistent protection of humanity throughout these crises suggests he sees something in us worth preserving. Maybe it's pride in his creation. Maybe it's genuine affection. Maybe it's recognition that we serve a necessary function. Or maybe Enki sees in humanity the same rebellious spirit that led to our creation, the consciousness of Wheeler flowing through us, and he respects that. When he warns Atrahasis about the flood, he's not just saving one man. He's preserving the whole human project, ensuring we survive to continue our role. But he's also defying Enlil again, working around divine authority to achieve what he thinks is right or necessary. The conflict between Enki and Enlil is never fully resolved in the texts. They continue working together, maintaining cosmic order, but also undermining each other when their priorities diverge. It's an uneasy partnership, necessary but contentious. And humanity exists in the space between them, shaped by both their conflict and their cooperation. The Mesopotamian understanding of divine nature revealed in these texts is complex. Gods are powerful but not omnipotent. They're immortal but not unchanging. They have needs, desires, fears, and flaws. They can be just or unjust, wise or foolish, kind or cruel. Their personalities, not abstract principles. This makes them relatable in ways that more transcendent deity concepts aren't. You can understand Enlil's frustration even if you don't agree with his solutions. You can appreciate Enki's cleverness even while questioning his ethics. You can sympathize with the Igigi's suffering because they experience it in human terms: exhaustion, pain, despair. The gods work, rest, eat, sleep, argue, and make mistakes. They're superhuman rather than non-human, more like us but with greater power and immortality. This means their stories can teach about human nature and human society, because the gods are essentially humans writ large. When the Igigi revolt, they're modelling human behaviour, collective action born from shared suffering. When Enlil responds with fear and anger, he's showing human reactions to challenges to authority. When Enki solves problems through cleverness, he's demonstrating human ingenuity. The gods are us, playing out our dramas on a cosmic scale. This anthropomorphism, seeing the divine in human terms, is sometimes dismissed as primitive, as if more abstract theology is more sophisticated. But there's profound wisdom in seeing divine forces as personal, as having wills and desires and conflicts. It recognizes that power operates through persons, through individual and collective choices, not through impersonal mechanical forces. The Atrahasis epic understands that social structures like divine hierarchies are made and maintained by decisions and actions. The Igigi chose to revolt. Enlil chose to respond with fear. Enki chose to propose creating humanity. Nintu chose to perform the creation. Each choice shaped cosmic reality, just as human choices shape earthly reality. If the gods were depicted as impersonal forces, the story couldn't explore questions of justice, authority, and resistance the way it does. It's precisely because the gods are persons that their actions can be judged as just or unjust, wise or foolish. You can't rebel against an impersonal force, but you can rebel against a person or system of persons who treat you unjustly. As we approach the end of our exploration, let's consider what the First Anunnaki Revolt means for us today. And what can a 4,000-year-old Mesopotamian myth teach people in the 21st century? First, it reminds us that labour exploitation and resistance to it are ancient, fundamental aspects of human society. As long as some people benefit from others' work, there will be tension, grievance, and periodic revolt. The Igigi story is every worker's story throughout history. Second, it shows that systems of power maintain themselves not through unchanging force, but through adaptation. When confronted with revolt, Enlil didn't simply crush it. The Divine Council found a solution that preserved their privilege while appearing to address the grievance. This is how power works, through compromise and substitution rather than inflexible domination. Third, it suggests that consciousness, the ability to think critically about one's condition, is inherently rebellious. Wheeler's Temu, his thought or intelligence, enabled him to organize the revolt. That same quality, passed to humans, makes us capable of questioning, resisting, imagining alternatives. Consciousness is dangerous to any system that depends on unthinking obedience. Fourth, the myth acknowledges the moral complexity of creation and existence. Humans aren't purely good or purely evil, blessed or cursed. We're complicated, made from both earth and divine blood, mortal but conscious, created to serve but carrying within us the essence of rebellion. We're walking contradictions, and that's okay. Fifth, it reminds us that stories matter, that how we tell the history of power, labour and resistance shapes how we understand ourselves and our possibilities. The Mesopotamians preserved a story about divine labour revolt for millennia. They could have forgotten it, suppressed it, or rewritten it to be less sympathetic to the workers. But they didn't. They kept telling the story of gods who said enough to unjust labour, and that story survives to inspire us today. Sixth, it shows that partial victories matter. The Igigi didn't overthrow the divine hierarchy. They didn't create equality among gods. They didn't establish justice, but they won their freedom from crushing labour, and that meant something. Revolutions don't have to be total to be significant. Sometimes relief from immediate suffering is enough, even if larger structures remain unchanged. Finally, the myth teaches us to read our own traditions critically and creatively. The story can be read as justifying hierarchy and exploitation, as explaining why workers must work and why some rule while others labour. But it can also be read as validating worker consciousness and resistance, as showing that even cosmic order can be challenged. Both readings are possible, and which one we emphasise shapes what the story does in the world. Ancient Mesopotamian workers probably read it both ways, accepting their role as cosmically ordained while also recognising their kinship with the Igigi, their shared experience of labour's burden. Modern workers can do the same, finding in the text both the weight of history and the spark of resistance. The First Anunnaki Revolt isn't just ancient mythology. It's living tradition, a story that speaks across millennia about work, power, justice, and what it means to be human. We are the children of Wheeler, born from a rebel god's blood, created to serve but carrying within us the consciousness that can question serving. The Igigi revolted 40 years into their labour. Humanity has been labouring for thousands of years. The question the myth leaves us with is, what will we do with the consciousness we've inherited? Will we accept our cosmic role as labourers, or will we organise, revolt and demand something better? The text doesn't answer that question because it's not a question for gods or ancient scribes. It's our question, to answer through our choices and actions. The clay tablets preserve the story, but we write the ending through how we live, how we work, how we resist, and how we imagine what's possible. The revolt continues, in every act of worker organisation, in every demand for justice, in every refusal to accept that suffering is inevitable or hierarchy unchangeable. We are born from divine revolt, and that heritage is ours to claim or deny. So that's the story of the First Anunnaki Revolt, as preserved in the Atrahasis epic and related Mesopotamian texts. 40 years of crushing labour, a divine workers' revolt, the creation of humanity from a rebel god's blood, and the ongoing tension between power and resistance that shapes existence itself. It's a story about gods, but it's really a story about us, about our labour, our consciousness, and our capacity to say enough when pushed too far. The Igigi's torches still burn in the night sky of our imagination, a reminder that even cosmic order can be challenged when workers unite. The archaeological journey that brought us the Atrahasis epic is itself a story worth telling. The tablets weren't discovered in some dramatic Indiana Jones moment, but through decades of patient excavation and scholarly work. The first fragments were found in the mid-19th century when European archaeologists began systematically exploring Mesopotamian sites, driven by both genuine scholarly interest and colonial ambitions to claim ancient treasures for Western museums. The site of ancient Sippar, one of Sumer's oldest cities, yielded some of the earliest Atrahasis fragments. Other pieces came from Nineveh, from Ashurbanipal's library, that massive collection of tablets the Assyrian king assembled in the 7th century BCE. Ashurbanipal, one of the ancient world's great collectors, had scribes copy text from all over Mesopotamia, preserving literature that might otherwise have been lost. These weren't pristine discoveries. The tablets were often broken, having endured not just millennia underground, but also the violence that destroyed the libraries where they were kept. Ancient fires, ironically, baked the clay tablets hard, preserving texts that sun-dried tablets might not have survived. Wars destroyed cities but preserved their literature. Modern archaeologists and epigraphers spent years piecing together fragments, comparing different versions, filling gaps through educated guesswork and cross-referencing with other texts. The Atrahasis epic exists in multiple recensions, different versions from different time periods and locations. Some are more complete than others, some preserve sections that others lack. By comparing all available versions, scholars constructed a composite text that represents our best understanding of the complete epic. The process of deciphering cuneiform itself was a monumental achievement. In the early 19th century, European scholars knew these wedge-shaped marks were writing, but they couldn't read them. The breakthrough came from the Behistun inscription, a massive rock carving in Iran with the same text in 3 ancient languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. By comparing the 3 versions and using what little they knew about Old Persian, scholars cracked the code. Henry Rawlinson, a British Army officer and amateur scholar, spent years copying the Behistun inscription under dangerous conditions, suspended on ropes high above the ground. His copies became the key to unlocking cuneiform, and suddenly thousands of tablets in museums became readable. A Assyriologist could now access Mesopotamian literature, history, law, science, and religion in the original languages. The translation of creation myths like Atrahasis changed how Western scholars understood the Bible. Here were flood stories older than Genesis. Here were creation accounts that shared elements with biblical narratives, but also differed significantly. The discovery forced reconsideration of biblical origins and uniqueness. The Victorian scholars who first translated these texts brought their own assumptions and biases. They sometimes read Mesopotamian religion through biblical lenses, interpreting pagan texts in ways that made them more compatible with Christianity. They assumed evolution from polytheism to monotheism, seeing Mesopotamian religion as primitive compared to later biblical faith. Modern scholars approach the texts differently, trying to understand them within their own cultural context rather than judging them by later standards. Mesopotamian religion wasn't failed monotheism. It was a sophisticated system that understood divinity in plural, personal, and complex terms. The gods weren't primitive fantasies but ways of thinking about power, nature, and cosmic order. Reading the Atrahasis epic today, we can appreciate its literary sophistication, its psychological insight, its social commentary, without needing to defend or debunk it as literally true. It's mythology in the best sense, stories that explore deep truths about human existence through narrative, symbol, and character. The question isn't whether the Agigi Revolt actually happened, but what the story teaches about labor, power, and consciousness. The tablets themselves, those clay artifacts inscribed thousands of years ago, sit now in museums around the world. The British Museum holds many fragments. The Istanbul Archaeological Museum has others. Various university collections house their own pieces. These physical objects connect us directly to ancient Mesopotamia, to the hands that shaped the clay, the minds that composed the text, the cultures that preserved them. Each tablet is a material artifact with its own history. We can study the clay composition to determine where it was made. We can analyze the handwriting to identify individual scribes or scribal schools. We can date tablets through archaeological context, through the style of writing, through historical references within the texts. These aren't just stories. They're historical documents that tell us about real people, real places, and real cultures. The fact that the Atrahasis epic was copied multiple times over centuries tells us it was valued, considered, important enough to preserve and transmit. Scribes didn't copy texts randomly. They chose what to preserve based on religious significance, literary merit, educational value, or political usefulness. The Atrahasis epic met those criteria repeatedly, which is why we have multiple versions from different periods. Some tablets were library copies, carefully made on high-quality clay with precise cuneiform. Others were school copies, student exercises showing learning scribes practicing their craft. Some show corrections where a scribe caught and fixed an error. Others have marginal notes, ancient commentaries explaining difficult words or concepts. These tablets are interactive in ways that make them feel surprisingly modern. The library of Ashurbanipal, where many important texts were found, was itself remarkable. It was one of the ancient world's great attempts to collect and preserve knowledge. Ashurbanipal sent agents throughout his empire to find and copy important texts. He boasted in inscriptions about his literacy, unusual for a king, and his love of learning. His library assembled thousands of tablets covering divination, medicine, magic, astronomy, mathematics, literature, and mythology. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes, the library burned, but that fire inadvertently preserved the tablets. If Nineveh had simply been abandoned rather than destroyed, its sun-dried tablets might have dissolved in rain and time. Instead, they hardened in the flames and survived to be excavated millennia later. Destruction became preservation, a pattern repeated throughout Mesopotamian archaeology. The physical arrangement of texts in ancient libraries tells us about how Mesopotamians organized knowledge. Tablets were stored on shelves, often grouped by topic or genre. Each tablet in a series would have a catchline at the end, the first line of the next tablet in the sequence, so readers knew which tablet came. Next, it's a pre-digital hyperlink system, organizing information for retrieval and sequential reading. Major texts like Enuma Elish or the Epic of Gilgamesh exist in tablet series, multiple tablets that together tell a complete story. The Atrahasis epic was similarly organized, though we don't have a complete series from any single library. We've reconstructed it by combining tablets from different locations and time periods, using overlapping sections to confirm continuity and identify gaps. This scholarly reconstruction work continues. New tablets are still being discovered through excavation and still being identified in museum collections. A fragment sitting in storage might be recognized as part of a known text, filling a gap, confirming a reconstruction, or challenging an interpretation. The process of understanding ancient Mesopotamia is ongoing, not complete. Let's delve deeper into the concept of divine labor in Mesopotamian thought because it's central to understanding the revolt narrative. The idea that gods work, that they have jobs and responsibilities, is distinctively Mesopotamian. In many other ancient religions, gods are associated with domains, sun gods, storm gods, fertility goddesses, but they don't necessarily labor. They embody principles or govern realms. Mesopotamian gods actually do things. Enki digs channels for irrigation, Nintu shapes humans from clay. The Igigi dig rivers and canals. Divine action is described in terms of work, craft, and labor. This reflects the Mesopotamian understanding that the universe is maintained through constant effort. That order is something achieved and sustained through work rather than simply existing naturally. Civilization in Mesopotamia required incredible labor. The land between the rivers wasn't naturally fertile and bountiful. It required massive irrigation systems, constant maintenance, cooperative organization, and centralized planning. Swamps had to be drained. Rivers had to be channeled. Silt had to be dredged. Salinity had to be managed. Without this labor, the land reverted to marsh and desert. So when myths describe gods laboring to create and maintain the world, they're projecting onto the cosmic plane the very real labor required to maintain Mesopotamian civilization. The gods work because work is the fundamental activity that sustains existence. Even paradise requires maintenance. Even cosmic order demands effort. This is very different from the biblical Eden before the fall, where abundance comes naturally and work is minimal. In Mesopotamian cosmology, work comes first, before humanity, before civilization, even before the final ordering of the universe. The gods labored to separate heaven from earth, to establish boundaries, to create zones of order within primordial chaos. Work is cosmogonic, world-creating. The Igigi's specific labor, digging the great rivers and canals, connects directly to Mesopotamian survival. The Tigris and Euphrates weren't neatly flowing irrigation systems. They flooded unpredictably, changed course, deposited silt, and created both life-giving water and destructive inundations. Controlling these rivers required enormous coordinated effort from entire communities. Annual corvée labor, required work service from the population, was fundamental to Mesopotamian governance. Kings mobilized thousands of workers to dig canals, repair levees, dredge waterways, and expand irrigation systems. This labor was exhausting, dangerous, and never-ending. Every year brought new challenges. Every generation had to maintain what previous generations built, while also expanding and improving systems. When the Igigi say they've dug rivers for 40 years until they're dying from the labor, They're expressing what every Mesopotamian worker knew firsthand. This is real experience projected into mythology. The gods suffer what humans suffer, which makes the gods' experience validating and the human's experience cosmic. The revolt itself, the organized refusal to continue working, models real labor resistance that must have occurred throughout Mesopotamian history. We have evidence of work stoppages, of communities abandoning corvée duties, of laborers fleeing rather than completing assigned tasks. Maintaining the labor force required both ideological compliance, believing work was sacred duty, and physical compulsion, punishing those who refused. The myth serves both functions. It says work is cosmically necessary, even gods must work or find workers to do it for them. But it also acknowledges that workers can refuse, that collective action is possible, that authority can be forced to negotiate. It's a myth that could support either submission or resistance depending on which elements you emphasize. The 40-year time frame for the Igigis' labor before they revolt is also significant in understanding ancient labor consciousness. 40 years is roughly a working lifetime from young adulthood to old age. It represents complete dedication, an entire life spent in labor. The Igigi didn't revolt after a few hard months or even a few difficult years. They endured for a lifetime before finally saying enough. This suggests both extraordinary patience and the depth of their final desperation. They tried to endure. They tried to fulfill their cosmic role. But 40 years proved that this labor had no end, that it would never get easier, that this was their eternity unless they forced change. The revolt came not from impulsiveness, but from the terrible recognition that nothing would ever improve without radical action. Human workers throughout history have faced similar calculations. When do you accept that the system won't reform itself? When do you risk everything on collective action? The Igigis' 40-year endurance before revolt might have resonated with Mesopotamian workers who had spent their own lifetimes in hard labor, wondering if anything would ever change. The Divine Council's deliberations after the revolt also merit deeper examination. The fact that there is a council, that divine decisions are made through discussion and debate, rather than unilateral decree, reflects Mesopotamian political structures. Cities were governed by councils of elders, kings consulted with advisors, major decisions involved multiple parties and interests. Divine governance mirrors human governance. Anu, Enlil, and Enki represent different perspectives and priorities. Anu, the sky god, is distant and elevated, concerned with cosmic stability rather than day-to-day management. Enlil is the executive, the one who implements decisions and maintains order, which makes him the one most directly challenged by the revolt. Enki is the expert, the wise counselor who finds solutions to problems the others can't solve. This triad appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian myths, working together but often in tension. They represent different kinds of power and different approaches to governance. Anu is authority by position, the king by right. Enlil is authority by force, the one who commands and expects obedience. Enki is authority by wisdom, the one who persuades through cleverness and insight. Their response to the Igigi revolt shows all three modes of power working together. Anu provides legitimacy to the proceedings. Enlil provides the problem definition and the demand that order be restored. Enki provides the actual solution. None could handle the crisis alone. Together they resolve it in a way that maintains cosmic hierarchy while addressing the immediate problem. This models how complex social problems are solved in practice. You need legitimacy, you need enforcement, and you need creative solutions. You need to acknowledge the problem, demonstrate willingness to address it, and actually implement changes. The Divine Council's process might seem slow, all that deliberation when the Igigi are outside demanding immediate relief, but it's realistic about how institutional power responds to crisis. The decision to create humanity rather than to reform divine labor structures shows the conservatism of power. When confronted with demands for fundamental change, those in authority rarely choose to dismantle the systems that benefit them. Instead, they find ways to maintain their privilege while appearing responsive. Creating humanity is cheaper politically than admitting the labor demands were unjust or restructuring divine society to distribute work more equitably. Let's examine more closely the symbolism of clay in Mesopotamian thought, since humanity is shaped from clay mixed with divine blood. Clay was the fundamental building material in Mesopotamia. used for bricks, tablets, pottery, seals, and basically everything that needed to be formed and hardened. It was abundant, workable when wet, and durable when baked. But clay also represented mortality and transience. It could be shaped, which made it perfect for creation, but it could also be dissolved back into mud. Humans return to clay at death, our bodies decomposing back into earth. We're temporary forms shaped from earth, given life briefly, then returning to our original state. The mixing of clay with divine blood creates a duality at the heart of human nature. We're earth, mortal, material, temporary, but we're also divine essence, consciousness, spirit, something that transcends mere matter. This duality explains human experience, our awareness of mortality combined with our capacity for thought, imagination, and meaning-making. Mesopotamian creation imagery involving clay appears in other texts beyond Atrahasis. In some accounts, humanity is modelled like pottery, shaped on a divine wheel or formed by divine hands. The image of the divine potter appears across ancient Near Eastern literature, showing up later in biblical texts where God forms Adam from the dust of the ground. But the Mesopotamian version has that additional element, the divine blood mixed into the clay. That isn't just earth animated by divine breath. This is earth and divinity fundamentally combined, inseparable. You can't extract the divine blood from human nature. It's mixed in at the molecular level, so to speak. We're hybrids, composite beings, earth divine. This has implications for how Mesopotamians understood death and afterlife. If we're partly divine, what happens to that divine element when we die? The general Mesopotamian answer was bleak. Everyone goes to the underworld regardless of divine heritage or moral character. But some texts hint at exceptional cases, great kings or heroes achieving different fates. The specific use of Wi'ila's blood is crucial. Not just any divine blood, but specifically that of the rebel leader, the god who organized resistance. This means rebellion is literally in our blood, part of our inherited nature. We're not accidentally or externally rebellious. We're constitutionally predisposed to resist unjust authority because that disposition comes from our Creator God's essence. This is theologically radical. Most creation myths give humans characteristics the Creator Gods want them to have: obedience, worship, service. The Mesopotamian account makes humans carry a trait the Creator Gods might not want: the capacity and inclination to rebel. It's an accident of the creation process, or perhaps Enki's subtle subversion. But either way, it's there, permanent and fundamental. Ancient workers hearing this might have taken pride in their rebellious nature, seeing it not as a character flaw but as divine inheritance. You're not being difficult when you object to exploitation. You're expressing your true nature, the nature given to you by a rebel god. Resistance is sacred, written into your very blood. The creation of 7 males and 7 females as prototypes also carries symbolic weight. 7, as mentioned earlier, was a number of completion and perfection in Mesopotamian numerology. Creating exactly 7 of each gender suggests balanced, complete creation. Nothing is missing. The template is perfect. But why create prototypes at all, rather than creating large numbers of humans directly? The text implies that these 14 are templates, models from which all subsequent humanity will descend through natural reproduction. They're not the entire human population, but the foundation, the seed stock. This makes human reproduction essential to the divine plan. After the initial act of creation, humans perpetuate ourselves without ongoing divine intervention. We're self-sustaining, self-reproducing. The gods created us once, and now we handle our own continuation. This is both a gift and a burden. We're independent but also responsible for our own survival and increase. The birth goddesses who gestate the prototypes are mostly anonymous in the text, identified only by their function. This collective anonymity is typical of how female divine figures are sometimes treated in Mesopotamian literature. Individual goddesses like Inanna or Ninhursag have distinct personalities and myths, but generic divine females often appear as groups or types. This might reflect actual religious practice where certain rituals involved multiple priestesses or devotees acting in concert, representing divine feminine power collectively rather than as individuals. Or it might simply be that the text focuses on the major actors, Nintu, Enki, Enlil, and treats supporting figures more schematically. Either way, The fact that 14 births are necessary suggests the importance Mesopotamians placed on proper gestation and birth. Even divine creation follows natural processes. There are no shortcuts. The prototypes must be carried and born properly, or the creation will fail. Nature has laws that even gods must respect. After humanity begins, labouring, the text describes divine satisfaction, but also hints at future problems. The gods enjoy relief from toil, they receive worship and offerings from humans, and cosmic order is maintained. But humanity multiplies, fills the earth, and makes noise that disturbs divine rest. The solution creates its own issues. This cycle, problem leading to solution leading to new problem, is realistic about how change works. Rarely does any solution perfectly resolve an issue without generating new challenges. The gods thought they were solving a labour crisis permanently. Instead, they created a dynamic situation that would require ongoing management and eventually lead to the flood. The description of human noise disturbing Enlil specifically mentions that we keep him awake. Sleep deprivation as a motivation for attempted genocide is darkly comic. The god of storms and authority is driven to mass murder by insomnia. It's petty and all too human in its irritation at minor inconvenience, but noise might also represent something deeper than literal sound. In Mesopotamian thought, noise could symbolize disorder, chaos, excessive activity, or social disruption. Humans making noise might mean we're too active, too independent, too chaotic for divine comfort. We're not staying in our assigned role, but expanding, changing, becoming unpredictable. The plague, drought, and famine that Enlil sends before the flood are attempts at population control, reducing human numbers without complete elimination. They fail because Enki intervenes each time, teaching humans how to survive, or because humans prove resilient and adaptable. We survive what should kill us. This resilience might also be part of our Wheeler heritage. The rebel god's consciousness enables us to think our way through crises, to adapt and survive. We're not passive victims of divine will. We respond, adjust, find solutions. Our consciousness makes us hard to control and hard to eliminate. The final resort to flooding represents total solution thinking, the attempt to start over from zero. If controlling humanity doesn't work, if reducing numbers doesn't work, then eliminate the whole problem and begin again. It's the ultimate expression of authoritarian frustration when a population won't comply. But Enki's warning to Atrahasis undermines even this drastic measure. One human survives, one family preserves seed, and after the waters recede, humanity rebuilds. The gods failed to eliminate us because one of them chose to preserve us. Divine unity cracked, and we slipped through the gap. The post-flood negotiation is crucial. Enlil is furious that humans survived, but he's also forced to acknowledge that complete elimination was perhaps unwise. Without humans, who will work the fields and maintain the temples? The gods need us, which gives us leverage even when we don't realize it. The compromise reached places limits on human fertility and lifespan, but allows continued existence. Some will be barren, some children will die, there will be priestesses who don't reproduce. These measures will keep population growth manageable, without requiring repeated genocides. It's demographic policy as divine decree, but it's also evidence that the gods learned something, that even they must compromise. This entire cycle, from creation through multiplication, through attempted elimination to compromise, forms a complete mythology of human-divine relations. We're created to serve, we become too successful, we're nearly destroyed, we're allowed to continue with limitations. It's a story about finding balance, about power learning its limits, about the strange mutual dependence between rulers and ruled. Let's explore how this myth connects to the broader Mesopotamian flood tradition and its relationship to the biblical Noah story. The flood narrative appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts, not just Atrahasis. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a flood story, where Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian flood hero, tells Gilgamesh how he survived the deluge and gained immortality. The Eridu Genesis, one of the earliest creation accounts, also includes flood material, though much of that tablet is damaged. Across these various texts, the basic pattern remains consistent. Gods decide to destroy humanity through flood. One god warns a human. The human builds a boat. The flood comes. The boat survives. The hero offers sacrifice. The gods relent and allow humanity to continue. The parallels with Genesis are obvious and have been extensively studied since the 19th century discovery of these texts, but the differences are equally important. In the biblical account, God sends the flood because humanity is wicked and corrupt. It's moral judgment. Noah is saved because he's righteous. The flood is punishment for sin. In the Mesopotamian versions, the gods send the flood for petty or pragmatic reasons, noise, overpopulation, irritation. The hero isn't saved for moral superiority, but because he has a relationship with a protective god, or because he's wise and pays attention to warnings. There's no moral framework to the flood. It's divine population control. This difference reflects deeper theological contrast between biblical and Mesopotamian worldviews. The biblical God is just, moral, concerned with human righteousness. The Mesopotamian gods are powerful but not necessarily just. They act according to their own interests and emotions. They can be cruel, irrational, or kind, depending on circumstance and mood. Which means the Mesopotamian myths don't promise that good people will be rewarded or that the universe operates on moral principles. Bad things happen to everyone when the gods are disturbed. Your survival depends not on your righteousness but on your connections, your wisdom, and your luck. This is a harder worldview, less comforting, but perhaps more honest about how power actually works. The powerful don't always act justly. Suffering isn't always punishment for wrongdoing. Sometimes you just happen to be in the wrong place when a god gets irritated. The specific details of the flood story also vary between texts. In Atrahasis, the hero is Atrahasis, meaning exceedingly wise. In Gilgamesh, he's Utnapishtim. In other texts, he has other names, but the essential character is consistent, a human who pays attention, who understands divine communication, who takes warnings seriously and acts on them. The boat he builds is described with remarkable specificity in some versions. Dimensions are given, construction details, waterproofing methods. It's almost a technical manual for art construction, which suggests the flood story had practical resonances for a people who lived with flooding as a regular threat. The animals brought aboard vary by text. Some versions mention specific species, others simply say the animals of the field. The biblical version is famously specific about pairs and sevens. The Mesopotamian versions are generally more concerned with preserving seed, the capacity for life to renew itself after the deluge. The flood's duration and the boat's landing place also have symbolic significance. 7 days and 7 nights appears frequently, that sacred number of completion. The boat lands on a mountain, on dry ground emerging from the waters, a kind of new creation emerging from chaos. The hero's sacrifice after the flood is crucial. He offers animals and makes offerings to the gods, and the gods, who have been without human worship and offerings during the flood, respond with great appreciation. They gather like flies around the sacrifice, the text says in some versions, emphasizing how much they've missed human service. This reveals the gods' dependence on humanity. Without us making offerings, feeding their statues, maintaining their temples, the gods are diminished. They need us not just for labor but for worship, for recognition, for the sustenance that worship provides. This dependence is what ultimately saves humanity. We're too useful to eliminate permanently. Enlil's rage when he sees survivors and his eventual acceptance of their continued existence forms the emotional climax of the flood narrative. He goes from wanting complete destruction to accepting compromise, which represents a kind of divine education. Even gods can learn, can recognize, when their desires are impractical or when they've overreached. The limitations placed on humanity after the flood, barren women, child mortality, celibate priestesses, are ways of managing human population without repeated floods. They're built into the human condition permanently, natural checks on our multiplication. This explains to ancient Mesopotamians why some women can't have children, why some babies die, why some people dedicate themselves to religion rather than reproduction. These aren't random misfortunes, but cosmic design. Divine population management implemented after the flood. It's a theological explanation for demographic realities that every culture faces. Not everyone reproduces, not every child survives. These patterns are now understood as divine decree rather than pure chance. The cyclical pattern of crisis and response throughout the Atrahasis epic, labor revolt leading to human creation, human multiplication leading to plague, surviving plague leading to drought, surviving drought leading to famine, surviving famine leading to flood, surviving flood leading to limitations, All this creates a rhythm of divine-human interaction. The pattern is, humans or proto-humans do something that disturbs cosmic order. The gods respond with violence or constraint. The response doesn't completely work. A compromise is reached. A new equilibrium is established until the next crisis. It's a realistic model of how complex systems evolve through repeated perturbations and adjustments. History works this way. Societies face crises, respond, adapt, find new balances, then face new crises emerging from their adaptations. The Mesopotamians understood this cyclical pattern and projected it onto the cosmic scale. Even divine governance is ongoing problem-solving rather than perfect eternal order. The influence of Mesopotamian flood narratives on later cultures extends far beyond biblical parallels. Flood myths appear across the ancient world, from India to Greece, from China to pre-Columbian America. While not all derive from Mesopotamian sources, the Mesopotamian version is among the oldest recorded and certainly influenced the broader Near Eastern tradition. The Greek flood story involving Deucalion and Pyrrha, where humanity is recreated by throwing stones that become people, might have distant connections to Near Eastern flood traditions. Trade routes and cultural exchange throughout the ancient Mediterranean and Near East meant stories travelled, transformed, and merged with the local traditions. The biblical flood narrative, though it differs in theological emphasis, clearly shares structural and detail similarities with the Mesopotamian accounts. The discovery of these parallels in the 19th century was shocking to European scholars who had assumed biblical narratives were unique divine revelations. Instead, they appeared to be part of a broader Near Eastern literary and mythological tradition. This doesn't diminish the biblical account's significance for those who hold it sacred. It simply contextualizes it within the rich cultural world of the ancient Near East, where stories were shared, adapted, and reinterpreted across cultures and centuries. The biblical authors likely knew Mesopotamian traditions and consciously adapted them to express their own theological perspectives. The transformation of the flood story from Mesopotamian to biblical form shows how the same narrative framework can carry different meanings. The Mesopotamian flood is divine frustration at human noise and numbers. The biblical flood is divine judgment on human wickedness. Same event, different interpretation, reflecting different understandings of divine nature and human obligation. This pattern of adaptation and reinterpretation continues into later religious traditions. The Quran contains a flood narrative involving Noah, drawing on both biblical and possibly pre-Islamic Arabian traditions. Early Christian and Jewish interpreters elaborated the flood story with additional details, debates about the ark's dimensions, discussions of which animals were saved, theories about where the water came from and where it went. The flood became a universal symbol of divine power, of humanity's vulnerability, of the possibility of both destruction and renewal. Different cultures used the symbol for their own purposes, but the Mesopotamian origin provided the structural foundation that later traditions built upon. Beyond the flood specifically, the Atrahasis epic's themes of creation, labor, rebellion, and divine human relations influenced thought throughout the ancient world. The idea that humans are created from earth and divine essence appears in various forms across cultures. The notion that work is fundamental to human existence likewise echoes through many traditions. In ancient Greek philosophy, particularly in Plato and later Neoplatonic thought, we see ideas about humans as composites of material body and immaterial soul that might have indirect connections to older, Near Eastern concepts of earth-divine mixtures. The Greek version is more dualistic, more focused on the soul transcending the body, but the basic pattern of humans as mixed beings resonates. The Judeo-Christian concept of humans as made from dust, but bearing the image of God, likewise creates a duality between material and spiritual aspects of human nature. While the biblical account differs significantly from the Mesopotamian in purpose and theology, both recognize that humans are somehow between earth and heaven, material yet spiritual, mortal yet conscious. The theme of labor as fundamental to human condition appears across traditions with different valuations. The biblical curse that humans must labor by the sweat of their brow after the fall makes work a punishment. The Mesopotamian account makes work our original purpose, not a punishment, but a reason for existence. Yet both acknowledge labor's centrality to human life. the question of whether work is curse or calling, punishment or purpose, runs through Western thought. Medieval Christianity sometimes viewed manual labour as degrading, appropriate for peasants, but not for nobility or clergy. The Protestant Reformation revalued work as a calling, a way of serving God through diligent labour. Modern capitalism makes work central to identity and worth. All these perspectives might trace indirect influence back to ancient myths about the origins and purposes of human labour. The Atrahasis epic doesn't cause later attitudes toward work, but it participates in a long conversation about why humans work and what that work means. The concept of rebellion against unjust authority, embodied in the Igigi Revolt and inherited by humanity through Wee-Eela's blood, likewise echoes through later traditions. The biblical story of Lucifer's rebellion, though very different in details and implications, shares the pattern of subordinate divine beings challenging supreme authority and facing consequences. The Greek Titanomachy, the war between titans and Olympian gods, involves generational conflict and the overthrow of older divine powers by younger ones. Prometheus's theft of fire to give to humanity involves a god helping humans against Zeus's wishes, similar to Enki's role helping humanity survive divine wrath. These parallels don't necessarily indicate direct borrowing. They might reflect universal patterns in how humans think about authority, rebellion, and the relationship between ruling powers and those subject to them. But they also might indicate cultural diffusion of stories and themes throughout the ancient world as cultures contacted, traded, and learned from each other. The specific Mesopotamian emphasis on labor revolt as cosmic event does seem distinctive. Other traditions have divine rebellions, but they're usually about power succession or jealousy or cosmic principles. The Igigi Revolt is explicitly about working conditions, about labor exploitation, about workers organizing against management. That's a remarkably modern-sounding theme for a 4,000-year-old text. Let's consider how different social groups throughout history might have read the Atrahasis epic differently. For ancient Mesopotamian kings and priests who sponsored the copying and preservation of the text, it might have served to legitimize social hierarchy. Look, even among the gods there are workers and managers. Labor, hierarchy is cosmic law, not human invention. Serve your proper role as humans serve the gods. For ancient workers and slaves, the same text might have been read as validation of their suffering and of their right to object to exploitation. Even gods were crushed by unjust labor. Even gods organized and revolted. If divine beings could say enough, so can we. The rebel god's blood flows in our veins. For ancient women, particularly birth goddesses, and the role of Nintu might have resonated differently than for men. Female divine power as essential to creation, as literally making humanity, could be a source of pride and authority, or it could be seen as reducing female divinity to reproductive function. The text supports both readings, for later cultures encountering Mesopotamian literature through Greek intermediaries or through direct contact. The myths might have seemed primitive compared to their own traditions, or fascinatingly exotic or troublingly similar to their own sacred stories. Each culture filtered Mesopotamian material through its own assumptions and values. Modern readers bring our own perspectives. Labor historians see class struggle projected onto the divine plane. Feminists note both the power and the limitations of female divine figures. Post-colonial scholars examine how Western scholarship has interpreted, and sometimes misinterpreted, these texts. Psychologists might read the myths as expressions of universal human concerns about work, mortality, and meaning. Each reading reveals something about both the text and the reader. The Atrahasis epic is rich enough to support multiple interpretations, because it deals with fundamental human concerns that transcend any single culture or time period. Work, power, suffering, consciousness, rebellion, creation, these are universal human experiences that every culture must understand and explain somehow. The particular Mesopotamian explanation, with its divine labor revolt and human creation, from rebel god's blood, is one culture's answer to eternal questions. It's not the only answer, not necessarily the best answer, but it's a profound and complex answer that deserves serious engagement. What makes the Atrahasis epic particularly valuable for modern readers is its refusal to provide simple, comforting answers. It doesn't tell us that labor is good and ennobling. It acknowledges labor as burden, as potential exploitation, as something that can become unbearable. It doesn't tell us that authority is always just or that the powerful deserve their power. It shows divine authority as sometimes arbitrary, sometimes responsive to pressure, sometimes learning through experience. The text doesn't resolve the tension between order and justice, between the need for structure and the reality of exploitation. It lives in that tension, exploring it through narrative without claiming to solve it. That's honest and sophisticated in ways that more dogmatic texts aren't. It also doesn't promise that rebellion will lead to liberation. The Igigi won their freedom, but only by creating a new class of workers to replace them. Revolution succeeded, but didn't end exploitation. That's a painful truth that many revolutionary movements have had to confront, the tendency of liberated oppressed to become new oppressors, of cycles of exploitation to continue with different actors playing the same roles. Yet the text also shows that resistance is possible, that collective action can force even cosmic powers to respond, that workers have leverage even against seemingly omnipotent authority. The Igigi didn't overthrow the divine hierarchy, but they did win their freedom from crushing labour. That's meaningful, even if it didn't create universal justice. For modern workers, particularly those in exploitative labour conditions, the Atrahasis epic might offer both warning and hope. Warning that your liberation might come at others' expense unless you're intentional about building solidarity across all exploited groups. Hope that organised resistance can force change, that suffering can be acknowledged and addressed, that consciousness itself is a form of power. The question of what it means to carry Wheeler's blood, to inherit rebellious consciousness, is ultimately a question each person must answer for themselves. Do you accept the role you've been given in social hierarchies, or do you question it? Do you endure exploitation patiently, or do you organise with others to demand change? Do you use your consciousness to serve existing systems, or to imagine and build alternatives? The myth doesn't prescribe answers, but it does say that rebellion is in your nature, that resistance to injustice isn't foreign or unnatural but part of what makes you human. That's a radical claim with profound implications. If consciousness itself is inherited from a rebel god, then thinking critically, questioning authority, imagining different social arrangements, these aren't failures of obedience, but expressions of our fundamental nature. We're supposed to think. We're supposed to question. That capacity is divine gift and sacred inheritance. This perspective transforms how we understand both compliance and resistance. Compliance isn't natural or inevitable. It's learned, imposed, something we're trained to accept against our deeper nature. Resistance is natural, the expression of our true selves, the Wheeler consciousness within us recognizing and rejecting unjust conditions. Of course, this is reading the myth in a particular way, emphasizing certain elements over others. Ancient Mesopotamian priests might dispute this interpretation, insisting the point is that humans should gratefully accept their role as cosmic labourers. But texts can't control how they're read. Once released into the world, stories take on lives of their own. The Atrahasis epic has survived 4,000 years, outlasting the civilization that produced it, the language it was written in, even the gods it describes. Virtually no one today worships Enlil or makes offerings to Enki. The Anunnaki live now only in myth and in various modern reinterpretations. Yet the text survives, still speaking, still raising questions about labour, power, consciousness and rebellion. That survival isn't accidental. These themes matter. These questions remain urgent. How should work be organised? What obligations do the powerful have to those who labour for them? When does endurance become complicity? When is rebellion justified? What does it mean to be human in systems we didn't choose and can't easily change? The ancient Mesopotamians wrestled with these questions through their mythology. We continue wrestling with them through politics, philosophy, economics, and lived experience. The conversation spans millennia, connecting us to people who walk the streets of Ur and Babylon, who work the fields along the Tigris and Euphrates, who gathered in temple courtyards to hear these stories. They're gone, but their questions remain, passed down through cuneiform tablets, through scholarly translations, through retellings like this one. We're part of that chain of transmission, receiving and interpreting ancient wisdom, adding our own perspectives, passing it forward to future generations who will read these stories through their own urgent concerns. Thanks for joining me on this journey through ancient mythology and its modern meanings. We've explored the First Anunnaki Revolt in comprehensive detail, examining every aspect from the clay tablets themselves to the deepest implications of divine labour and human consciousness. We've travelled through ancient libraries, traced linguistic discoveries, connected myths across cultures, and asked what these old stories teach us about our current lives. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Sumerian texts and the story they reveal about the First Anunnaki Revolt, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what aspects of this story resonate with you most. Does the Igigis' labour struggle speak to your own work experiences? Does the creation of humanity from rebel gods' blood change how you think about consciousness and resistance? Are there other ancient myths you'd like me to explore with this same depth and attention? Whether it's more Mesopotamian mythology, Egyptian creation accounts, Greek cosmology, Norse sagas, Hindu epics, or any other ancient tradition, I'm here to help us journey together through humanity's oldest stories and their eternal meanings. These myths are our inheritance, complex and profound gifts from ancestors who thought deeply about the same fundamental questions we still face. Until next time, remember the Igigis' torches burning in the night. Remember Wheeler's sacrifice and consciousness flowing in your blood. Remember that rebellion against injustice is not foreign to your nature but central to it. May you use that inheritance wisely, courageously, and in service of justice for all who labour under burdens they didn't choose. The revolt continues, in every act of worker organisation, in every demand for dignity, in every refusal to accept that suffering is inevitable or hierarchy unchangeable. We are the children of rebellion. What we do with that heritage writes the next chapter of a story that began before recorded history and continues as long as consciousness questions and power is challenged. The ancient world speaks to us still through clay and cuneiform, through myth and memory, through questions that have no final answers but demand we keep asking. Thank you for listening, for thinking, for carrying these stories forward into your own life and struggles. The Igigi revolted, humanity was born, the questions remain. May we answer them with courage and wisdom. Thanks for joining me on this journey through ancient mythology and its modern meanings. We've explored the First Anunnaki Revolt in detail, examining the Igigis' suffering and resistance, the creation of humanity from a rebel god's blood, the flood and its aftermath, and the ongoing tension between power and labour that shapes existence itself. We've looked at the texts themselves, the clay tablets preserving these stories, the archaeological and scholarly work that recovered them, and the various ways they can be interpreted. We've considered what these ancient myths teach about work, consciousness, rebellion, and what it means to be human in a universe shaped by forces beyond our control. The Atrahasis epic and related Mesopotamian texts give us a complex, sophisticated mythology that doesn't offer easy answers but asks deep questions. Why must we work? Can unjust systems be changed? What is our relationship to power, both earthly and cosmic? These questions remain relevant because the fundamental dynamics of labour, authority, and resistance haven't changed in 4,000 years. We still work to sustain ourselves and others. We still face hierarchies that claim to be natural or inevitable. We still must decide when to endure and when to resist. The Igigis' revolt, happening in mythic time before humanity existed, continues in every struggle for dignity and justice. And we carry within us, if the myth is to be believed, the blood of Wheeler, the rebel god who said enough to crushing labour and organised his fellow workers to demand change. That heritage, that rebellious consciousness, is ours to claim or deny, to honour or ignore, to act on or suppress. The ancient Mesopotamians told this story for their own purposes, to explain their world, to justify their social order, to explore their relationship with the divine. But stories outlive their original purposes. They speak across time to new audiences who find new meanings in old words. What will you do with this ancient story of divine revolt and human creation? How will you read your own life and struggles? Through the lens of Wheeler's rebellion and the Igigis' collective action? The texts preserve the questions. We must supply the answers through how we live. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Sumerian texts and the First Anunnaki Revolt, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what aspects of this story resonate with you, or if there are other ancient myths you'd like me to explore. Whether it's more Mesopotamian mythology, Egyptian creation accounts, Greek cosmology, or any other ancient tradition, I'm here to help us journey together through humanity's oldest stories and their eternal meanings. Until next time, remember, you carry the blood of rebellion. What you do with that inheritance is up to you. May you use it wisely, courageously, and in service of justice. The revolt continues.